KZSU-FM Stanford, welcome to another edition of Hearsay Culture. My name is Dave Levine. I'm a professor at Elon University School of Law, as well as an affiliate scholar at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School. Today, Hearsay Culture turns to a technology which is on the cutting edge, not just of technology itself, but of what we conceive technology as capable of doing. The focus is holographic technology. The guest is Bsky CEO Kris Chaisanguanthum, who is joining us from his home office in Kansas City, Missouri. Bsky is a company that is focused in a direction that we have only really, I think, thought about, at least folks that aren't in this field, in terms of science fiction and entertainment. When you think about a hologram, at least for me and my generation, I think of something like R2-D2, famously beaming Princess Leia to Mark Hamill playing Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi. We can also think about even Superman, who, as the Superman story goes, was taught by holographic projections of his biological parents when he was learning all of the skills that he had. But of course, we're moving technology from the science fiction realm into reality. And Hearsay Culture has been at the front and really has prided itself at being on the cutting edge of discussing these technologies before they are widely launched. Hearsay Culture over the last 15 years has had folks on discussing everything from 3D printing to artificial intelligence before people were aware that this technology even existed, much less being used. And holographic technology, to some degree, is in that space. Although, as we're going to talk about, holographic technology is used today in areas like entertainment. When you look at the Bsky website lays out in rather stark and in important terms the direction of the conversation we're going to have today. Right at Bsky, and that's bsky.io, the big tagline is "Do more and see more." Today's images are flat, but they don't have to be. Bsky makes rich, multi-perspective imaging a reality with light fields. Now, this is not a commercial, I want to be clear, for Bsky. However, discussing this technology, right, requires that we discuss given companies. And in this case, and we've done this before on the show, we're going to be talking to Kris about his company. But more broadly, we're going to be talking about what the technology is capable of doing. What are the ethics surrounding creating the technology? What are its limitations? And where do we see it going? Kris Chaisanguanthum is someone who I have known, and it shocked me when I was thinking about this. I have known Kris since really the inception of Hearsay Culture. Kris is a PhD from Stanford University and was getting his PhD in physics at the same time that I was a resident fellow at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School. So I say that by way of disclosure, and that Kris and I have known each other for quite a while, although we really weren't in touch until rather recently when I reached out to him as someone who was using and creating a technology that I thought was really cool, and I wanted to talk with him about that technology and about future plans for Hearsay Culture. But knowing Kris for 15 years really does give me a perspective on this. And so therefore, Kris, it's very special to have you on today, not just to discuss holograms, but to reconnect with someone that I was really fond of and knew well 15 years ago.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. It's actually it's fun to be here, especially considering that I used to do the show on KZSU before this show.
Yes.
So it's kind of fun to be on the other side of that transition and be like on the show.
Yes, exactly. The Falcon becomes a falconer and so forth. And Kris had a very interesting show that we'll talk about. Not really much, but did a show playing hip hop music, which was a lead-in to Hearsay Culture, which is a separate conversation we could probably have offline or elsewhere. Kris, thanks for being here today. You do have a fascinating background. Let's turn away from radio for a moment, at least KZSU, and talk about your background and how it led you here.
Yeah. So I think, to talk about what led me here, I think it's probably useful to talk about what here is. So yeah, at Bsky, we build technology to make holograms, basically. We make software that makes holograms. And so, I think it's worth sort of articulating what a hologram is. And really, the good example that everyone's familiar with is the little sticker of a bird on your credit card. I don't know if they still make them, but that's my obvious example. And so if you think about what a hologram really is, it's just a picture that moves as you move, right? So when you move your head around, what you see changes. And it's just like looking at a scene through a window. It's like, things move because of how far away they are. When things come in front of each other, one will occlude the other, things like that. So if you think about virtual reality and augmented reality, and even now, like there are like holographic displays, this is basically just the same thing. You just see something different as you move around. Now, with a VR headset, which I think is the sort of earliest example of these three things, it turns out that they're not using special technology. What they're in terms of like display, what they're doing is just tracking your movement and changing what you see. And so that's sort of what a hologram is. And our specific contribution is that right now, if you put on a VR headset, most of what you'll see is typically generated in a computer graphics environment. So it's basically something like a Unity, DirectX, OpenGL, things like that. And so all the primitives that that generate what you see are basically polygons that are colored and textured like a video game. And so I think it's our contribution is to try to get away from that, because it's actually really hard to capture certain things about the world that way. So the thing that I like to say is that if you play a football game like a Madden, or I guess it's still called Madden, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Some of the scenes look almost like they're real, right? It's like, if you're in a sports bar and there's a commercial for Madden that you catch out of the corner of your eye, like, oh, is that a football game? It's like, oh, no, that's an ad for Madden. But then if you play like one of the NBA games, they don't look anything like, you're never going to make that, that confusion. And it's because, really important things like people are very hard to capture in a 3D environment. And so that's sort of what we're doing, is we're basically trying to serve that holographic content need, but in a way that actually is not based on 3D graphics, in a way that's more like photography, so that you actually get people who look like people in these sorts of experiences. And so I think about Visby in some sense as an imaging company, and we're essentially extending photography to be in 3D. Now, in terms of background, I think that I identify first and foremost as a physicist. I think that people think of physicists often as people who study things like electrons and black holes. And I think that that's a little bit wrong. I think that a physicist is not really defined by what you study, but really how you study it. I think that there's a very specific toolkit that you get in terms of trying to break down problems and trying to fundamentally understand what are the questions that you're supposed to ask and what are the important ways to answer them. And it turns out that the toolkit that you get works really well on things like black holes and electrons. And in fact, that's actually what I was doing at Slack. So when I was
at Slack,
I was.
Go ahead.
Right.
What is Slack? Just for the people.
That's right. Slack is, or I guess it kind of was. It's a huge electron gun. It's a 2-mile long electron gun, because what people don't realize is that a lot of particle physics is basically you smash things together at really high energy, and you just see what happens. My PhD, I think it was my PhD advisor, but it might have been Feynman, who said like, the particle physicist is somebody who wants to know how a wristwatch works, so you throw it really hard against the wall and see what happens. And so, and that time I think was actually I still think of it as my intellectual first love is particle physics. And I was actually doing really cool stuff for my PhD. I measured some fundamental constants of the universe, like the kinds that get printed on posters that go into high school science classes. But also things that I'm 5 sigma confident will never ever affect anybody's daily life. Just we know that you can't isolate quarks and things like that. Right. And so I think the natural thing for me to do at that point was to go to CERN. That would have been the obvious career move had I stayed in that direct field. But I didn't really want to leave the U.S. for a number of reasons, both professional and personal. And one of my my undergraduate advisor, she used to complain, the problem with grad students that go to Slack is that they leave physics because they don't want to leave the Bay Area. And so I ended up staying. I just as a point of clarification, I was actually a PhD student at Harvard, but I was doing my work at Slack. But
doing work at Slack. Okay, fair enough. Sorry.
But I mean, and so I ended up doing a postdoc at UCSF. There's a physicist named Jerry Swartz, who actually made a lot of money, developing barcode reading technology. And so he actually sponsors a Swartz Foundation, and he's a big proponent of it, very active in it. And they basically recruit people that have these like very hard mathematical skills into neuroscience, because he thought that was a very important thing. So I ended up actually working at UCSF for a number of years. I was actually drawn to the field by some papers that I'd read in as an undergrad by a guy named Adick. And basically, it was about using first principles and information theory to make predictions about biology, which really blew my mind. So I ended up working at UCSF, on a lot of really cool stuff. Some stuff about basically decoding how neurons do computations. Some of the stuff that I worked on ended up going to Facebook, and some of it, actually went up. One of the labs that I worked with was actually acquired by Elon Musk and became his Neuralink.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
But actually,
well, that's a whole separate topic of discussion.
Yeah, we could definitely do an episode about
or how you feel about that technology going in that direction. But maybe we'll focus on holograms.
Yeah. I will say that my favorite thing that I did as a neuroscientist slash biophysicist was we actually were able to get some of our lab results and connect it to Major League Baseball pitch data. And so we actually put Clayton Kershaw on the cover of the Journal of Neuroscience. But anyway, so it was actually during that time that I started thinking about a few things that became, what I'm doing now. And specifically, obviously I was doing visual neuroscience. And so like understanding like how we create a picture of the world through, the things that we're able to see, but also on a more abstract level, thinking about what information really is, and the difference between information and data. And ultimately, I think that sort of ties in very well to Visby. Is ultimately like that's what imaging is like what's the difference between information and data, and how do you get information out of data?
And which is an amazingly, I think relatively simple way to describe a technology which seems so utterly mysterious and almost inscrutable in the sense that it's hard to understand. We're chatting with Kris Chaisanguanthum, the CEO of Visby on KZSU-FM Stanford and Hearsay Culture. So there's a lot of jargon that exists in your field, and you've already started to allude to some of it. Let's make this at least more understandable, and then deal with the complexity. So when I was researching for this interview, I kept coming across article after article that was talking about AR, and VR and holographic technology. So why don't you describe what each of those are, define them, and what the difference would be in a couple of minutes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, it's interesting because I actually would argue the problem is that there's not enough jargon, because to me the word jargon means like a very rigorously defined technical term. And a lot of these terms have been sort of blurred by the way that they get used, by product and market people, which is fine because you have to communicate with. But yeah, so I think that I can tell you what I think these things mean to me.
Yep.
And so like obviously like I sort of explained to me what a hologram is. It's basically it's a picture or a movie that what you see changes as you move around, and presumably it changes in such a way that it simulates the presence of you there or that thing here. Now, just to be clear, there is a contingent of people, the traditional traditional holographic artists that did analog holograms, like the bird on your credit card, who would probably get who don't really like that characterization, because they use the word to very specifically mean a picture that gets that effect through a very specific physical process, blah, blah, blah. But I think that it's fair to say that, like a lot of the people in the industry are essentially using it to mean that sort of spatial image that and so I think that in terms of the various flavors of applications for VR.
And so virtual reality.
Yeah,
right?
And virtual reality, like I think as an imaging company, to us, these are not really different. They're just sort of like product layer on top of the same fundamental like imaging technology. Obviously, the way they're instantiated, and there's a lot of other different technologies that that go into each one that are not necessarily our purview. VR, virtual reality, people generally think of as as typically an immersive experience. So something that you wear a headset and you are in that world, you don't really see outside of that world. It's like something that is basically just a new reality. You can move around. This is probably the first thing that people think of. You have your Oculus that Facebook acquired. Obviously, fun fact: the actually most the most VR headsets out there is actually the PlayStation virtual reality system, not Oculus. But there's a lot of really high quality headsets out in the field. Augmented reality, on the other hand, is actually more about combining digital elements into like objects into the real world. And so that can mean a lot of things. I think that the first like big example that I think people like to talk about is Pokemon Go, where you use your phone, and basically there's these Pokemons that you collect. I guess Pokemon is probably the plural of Pokemon because it's Japanese. But it's basically some sort of like virtual world that's sort of superimposed onto the real world. Another good example of this is there are apps where if you are thinking about buying furniture or something, you can sort of have it appear in your room so you can see how it's going to look. That sort of thing. And typically these are either accomplished through some sort of video pass-through, right? Like if you have like a video camera that composites objects onto your screen through that onto a camera capture. Another possibility is like you have headsets that actually are semi-transparent, like the Microsoft HoloLens. I think Magic Leap is another famous example. Although that's so that's generally like broadly speaking, VR versus AR. And I think that there were a couple of other terms that you had asked me about earlier. Computer vision was one of them, I think.
Yeah. And light fields, since we're working through all the definitions.
Yeah. Computer vision, I think, is just basically like any sort of it's really any sort of like algorithmic technology that uses camera input or visual input. So I think it's a little bit of a it's a little bit weird that it's its own thing now because it's such a integrated part of like a lot of systems. And obviously self-driving cars is a very, very obvious example. But even the machine at the post office that reads the zip codes to sort the mail, that's also technically computer vision. And it's a very, very rich and beautiful field. And light fields is actually probably the hardest one right now. Yeah. Light fields is used by a lot of people to mean a lot of different things. I think that the way that I use it, and we use it internally, and I think it's actually like a pretty, it's a somewhat uncontroversial definition, is that actually refers back to a physicist named Andre Gershon in 1936. But the ideas actually go back to Faraday, Michael Faraday. And the idea is that, in the same way that you have a gravitational field or an electric field, it's basically a quantity that can be measured at any point in space, right? There's also a light field, right? You can put a camera and point it anywhere in space and you'll measure something. And so just the sum total of where all the light is at this given moment is the light field.
Yeah, and when this idea of the light field, to me, was the most revelatory concept in understanding holographic technology for me. The idea being that you're not projecting a picture, right, with light fields, but rather what are you projecting?
Yeah, so I guess the way that I think about it is that if you think about like if you think about a picture, right? A picture is essentially the description of all the light that's going through the aperture of the camera, right? So imagine that you could record and play back not just like a single point, but actually a whole window. And so that as you moved around behind the window, you were actually getting what you would see as if you were actually looking through the window. And to me, that's, I think, the easiest definition of a light field. It's sort of like you're looking at a window that's recreating what's actually behind the window. So it's actually sort of like, I guess, looking through glass. So like if you were doing, a light field teleconference, it would be like, it would be like that person is there, but you can't touch them because there's like a piece of glass, like maybe like a prison visit or something like that.
Is it, to sum this up, and again, we're chatting with Kris Chaisanguanthum of bsky on KZSU-FM, Stanford, and Hearsay Culture. Fundamentally, is it too simple to say, therefore, that the fundamental difference between holograms and holographic technology and every other technology that presents images, right, up until now is 2D versus 3D, as you indicate on your website, or is that, in your view, an oversimplification?
No, I think that's a pretty good functional definition.
Okay, so let's turn now to, and focus on the fact that this is actually being used, right? Where is holographic tech being used now? And let me define used as meaning it's being put into practice, not tested.
Yeah, it's funny because VR, for example, has been the next big thing for the last 20 years.
Right. Right. Exactly.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because I think that if you look at, for example, fundraising trends, VR was very hot maybe 5 years ago, and then it sort of came back down in favor of AR and things like that. And I think that the extent to which the recent VR has sort of disappointed, I think, is actually more because of the hype. I think that actually, if you look at uptake numbers of a new technology, it's actually pretty good. And in fact, there's about 5 million or so, I think, headsets get sold a year. But the problem is, I think that fundamentally the problem with any sort of new display and imaging technology is you have to lift an ecosystem, right? Mm-hmm. You have to. Nobody wants to spend a lot of money on content if there's not a big user base, but people don't want to buy devices if there's not a lot of content. And that's what happened with 3D TV, for the listeners who remember that.
Right.
But nonetheless, there are a lot of headsets out there, and I think that if you take the broad view that that even that any sort of holographic content that changes VR gaming, that is a thing. It's a very popular thing. So so it's definitely so these sorts of things are definitely in use there. VR and AR is obviously that's that I'll talk a little bit more about that. I think the other thing that a lot of people may not realize is that holographic screens that don't require you to wear glasses are also here and in market. I think, for example, Hewlett Packard Labs, HP Labs, they spun out a company called Leia, named after Princess Leia. That's for example, they have one technology to build these sorts of screens that they've licensed to to cell phones and tablets. Sony came out with a and truth be told, if I had to bet, I would guess that the sort of mass uptake of holographic technology may be through these devices, at least at the consumer level. In part because I think that if you look at how often people replace their phone, I think that Samsung actually they demonstrated a phone that has this technology as well. People typically replace their phones on average. I think the turnover is something like a year and a half. So that's probably where where you can expect faster uptake. And the other issue is also I think that the problem with wearable devices is I think that people, especially people who are interested in technology like I am, people tend to underrate how much convenient technology wins over good technology sometimes. And so the things that require the least amount of user behavior modification often win. So so I think that those are so in terms of the consumer level, you have all these things going on. As I mentioned, the PlayStation is a big thing. I think that in terms of entertainment, there's gaming. They're doing concerts inside Fortnite.
Right.
Oculus has done some pretty compelling documentary stuff with Sir David Attenborough. Mm-hmm. But what I think a lot of people may not realize is actually a lot of the energy here is actually in industry and commercial use. I think the Microsoft HoloLens, for example, they're doing a lot more stuff in terms of manufacturing and training and things like that.
What so I do want to get to some of the challenges associated with this technology, Kris, because they're significant. But let me build off of everything you've just said and ask you this. A listener that's now been listening for 24 minutes or so, right, has heard about a technology which is being used to some degree, but now could be available at some point via mobile phones, right? Phones that that really have been, fairly, static in terms of their use for several years. How close are we to being at the point where we're discussing holograph and holographic technology the same way today we talk about the internet? I mean, it is part of our lives. Or is that not the goal of holographic technology, the way that, let's say, the internet, right, clearly had a goal in that direction?
Yeah, I think that you're right. I think that this is the sort of thing where it will become embedded into the fabric of computing. And I think that there's actually a lot of infrastructure that's being built for things like this. I think that at some point we won't think of, for example, augmented reality as a thing. It will just be like, in the same way that I don't think of the internet as a thing at this point, right? You just, when you pick up a computer, you assume that it's connected to the internet, and then if you load up a browser and it doesn't work, you kind of assume that something's broken. Right. And I think that's exactly what's going to happen. Because I think that eventually we'll get to the point where there isn't as much of a reason to not use holographic technology, just because it's essentially like it's essentially a transition in imaging, right? In the same way that first we had pictures at all, right, and then we had color pictures, and then we had moving pictures, and then talking pictures, and then digital pictures, and I think it's just a sort of natural evolution of imaging technology.
So telling, we're recording this interview on February 10th, 2021, right? Tell someone on February 10th, 2022, why they should use holographic technology as opposed to the existing technology that they have. What's the argument? In other words, I'm pushing back a little bit, right? Because I'm curious. I mean, obviously, I think it'll make good radio, and it's good question to ask, right? Why? I mean, what the internet, right, is, as you allude to, right, is ultimately, in a lot of ways, a utility, right? It operates the way that telephone wires operate, in a manner of speaking. It operates the way that electricity operates, in a manner of speaking. Are you suggesting that holographic technology would have that same valence, that same currency? And if so, how so? How would you make that case a year from now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I mean, I think that there is a little bit of a question of like, what is the real like killer app for all this?
Right. Okay.
And I don't think that you would have mass agreement necessarily. I mean, I think one of the things that people talk about, for example, is holographic telepresence. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think that you could have, I mean, you brought up Princess Leia. I mean, I think that there is a sense in which, all these things that contribute to lowering the suspension of disbelief, makes it easier to do things. It makes telecommunications feel that much more of a better substitute for when physical presence isn't there. You can often communicate a lot of information that you can't necessarily communicate through a standard 2D flat image. We're specifically actually interested. One of the things we're interested in is actually how we can leverage this for computer vision. Just because, like, computer vision is kind of interesting because if you think about a camera, it's based on the same technology as the human eye, but that's because we have biological retina, I guess retina. And so like our eyes see a certain way, but we've thrown away a lot of information. There's no reason why computers have to see that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, if you have like a natively holographic camera, a lot of computers can see a lot of things more easily, like shapes of objects, how far things are, what things are made out of. These are things that are actually a lot easier to read out of holographic images. But even for just communications and collaborations, like when you have people that are working together remotely on things like fashion, building stuff, if you're trying to sell a car or a house, things like that. I mean, I think that it's funny because like we don't really think about it because we've been raised in a world where we're very used to seeing two-dimensional images, but it's actually also very artificial, right? In a weird way, I think that there's this weird notion of, and this is sort of by way of analogy, there's a weird notion of verisimilitude that many American movies have, like the way people talk, and but people from other countries who see our movies think that they all sound weird and stilted and artificial. And it's just that we've come to accept that um, as normal and real, because that's sort of the kind of movie dialogue that we've been trained to see. And
Right.
similarly, I think that, in the same way that people still like vinyl and people still like, analog film, I think that there is a certain element that, people that are our generation are used to it, and we don't realize the things that, that we're losing because of that. And I think that, it's one of those things where, as we start to appreciate how much more rich the imagery can be, along this new axis, it will be hard to sort of go back in time, right? That's the weird thing. I remember like getting, when I was a kid, I remember getting a Super Nintendo,
Mhm.
and these 16-bit graphics, oh my God, they were so great. And like now you can barely look at them, right? And that's kind of the funny thing, is like, so we've sort of been trained for the specific moment in technological history that we exist in. And I think that it's always just going to move forward, just because I think that ultimately, with better information, better visuals that are more convincing and more like real life, that's going to make it, like I said, the suspension of disbelief to actually believe that you're actually seeing something. I think that that's something that's very salient, at least for the consumer.
We're chatting with Kris Chaisanguanthum, the CEO of Visby, the holographic technology company, on KZSU-FM Stanford and Hearsay Culture. KZSU is a nonprofit, non-commercial radio station at Stanford University that requires donations from listeners like you to continue its diverse programming. You can email our underwriting department at underwriting@kzsu.stanford.edu, or go to our webpage and click on Donate to KZSU. Regardless, I hope that you continue listening to the station. Kris, let's pivot here to some of the challenges associated with this technology. The history of hearsay culture, really going back to the very beginning, has been one of celebrating new technologies while attempting to get to the challenges associated with their deployment. New technologies raise a host of concerns. I think some of those concerns for holographic technology are repetitive, but here's in terms of having seen them before. But let me ask you this question. Several years ago, I had on Shallon Valor, who wrote a book called Technology and the Virtues, and her push, and others like Ed Felton at Princeton, have pushed for really having a very strong ethical component into coding. Now, every technology that has been a focus of this show, starting with the internet itself, you could make the case that ethics either played no role or played a very small role, right? I mean, and you think about this in the context of the general idea that technology is neutral, right? And it's how people use the technology that really makes the technology good, or in quote unquote, or bad, quote unquote. How do ethics enter into your equation in your company and in your industry, considering that this technology is, as you point out, potentially a game changer?
Yeah, that's right. That's a really good question. I will say that I think that I think that the extent to which I have ideas about this are probably not necessarily specific to holographic technology, and perhaps just my view as a technologist, I guess. Um, and I mean, and I think that the other thing that's probably important to point out is, like, I think that a lot of what we think of as being ethical ideas or principles are often not necessarily as universal as we think that they are. And so when you talk about like ethics, I interpret that, at least at a functional level or a phenomenological level, to mean something like business practices that don't account for like social cost, right? That's but anyway. But yeah, I generally I do start with the general view that technology is not necessarily inherently good or bad. I do think that I think that companies are inherently amoral entities, right? Obviously, like I have a lot of documents and laws that compel me to act in the fiduciary duty of the company, and even if I have compunctions about doing certain things, I am also in a competitive industry, so I have exogenous pressures as well,
Mhm.
from people who may not have the same compunctions. I actually, it's funny because I think that one of the big things that people have talked about in the last, in terms of ethics, for example, in the last few election cycles, is the fact that Amazon doesn't pay any taxes, And like I think it's, whether or not they should pay taxes is one question, um, but I think it's funny that if you think that they should, that you think they're just going to. Like, I don't even think there's an accounting mechanism for Jeff Bezos to just give the government like a bunch. And so yeah, like I think
there is, but the question is whether there's a willingness to do so,
yeah,
which of course has been a bullet issue. Yeah.
right. But like, and so I also think that technology is similarly neither good or bad, and I don't romanticize it specifically as being good or bad. I do think that what happens though is that when technology is deployed at scale, then it becomes a massive lever, right? And so I think that that is something that you have to sort of deal with. Now, as the founder of an early stage startup, if we get a lever, if we are able to build a lever large enough that this is an issue, then obviously that's a very good problem to have, and that's what we're trying to do. But like I do think that I do subscribe to the view that technology levers human behavior, but I also think that if you lever yourself and there are negative consequences, somebody has to sort of be accountable for them, right? And so it's like you can kill somebody by driving a car. Thus, when you get your driver's license, you have to have a bond or insurance that can cover that. And similarly, if you trade exotic options with huge downside, you have to be able to cover them, at least in theory. I guess maybe not after the last 2 weeks, as it turns out.
Right.
And so yeah, I mean, I absolutely. I mean, I think the problem though is I think that it's ultimately very, very hard because I don't think you really want to centralize the development of technology. And it's not really because I mean, whether or not one should do that, and because out of principle versus as well as whether or not that's a good idea given the current government, those are separate questions. But it's not even that. I think it's more that I think that what actually is really important for technological development is a certain kind of agility that you get with having just these small startups that are failing on a daily basis, right? It's sort of like evolution, right? You have these like things that happen.
But does that mean, Kris? So look, as a policy matter, in at least in the United States, we have put serious limitations on, for example, the development of cloning technology, right? And we've done that because I'm not that I'm saying we can clone human beings, but we have certainly limited, right, how much study goes in that direction because as a matter of humanity and policy, we don't want people cloning. Now, I'm not suggesting that holographic technology is the same as cloning, but I do want to talk about this. But there are risks associated with, right, rendering jobs completely, right, non-essential to the point of not existing through this technology. As an ethical matter, right? As an ethical matter, why should we society trust any profit-making entity, yours or any other, with the power to make that decision? Because that is, in a very real way, what has happened with social media, right? With regard to Facebook and Twitter, the private entities becoming effectively the speech platform for government. So what do you say to that comparison?
And I actually agree with you 100%. I mean, I think that what I was trying to articulate is actually that I think these questions are actually really hard.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I think that I have a moral compass, but I also don't think that I don't think that that anybody should trust me to make these sorts of decisions just because I happen to be good at math, right? I mean, and partly it's it's not even that you can't trust people, but I think it's just really bad systems engineering to create a system where you have so many multiple points of failure, and especially you think about a lot of these technologies. A lot of technology right now is built to drive user engagement, right? So there's very little opt-out at this point. So yeah, I actually I wholeheartedly agree that there should be some mechanism. I think the thing that I'm trying to articulate though is that I think it's really hard to figure out what that is. Now I think that cloning.
But isn't that but Kris? Then I'm going to ask you. So isn't that haven't you just made the case for putting the brakes on going a lot further with holographic technology until we have a better understanding of what we want it to do?
Well, I think the problem is actually that you don't really know what it can or cannot do until you don't know, right? And that's the thing, right? Like to use the social media comparison, I don't think that Mark Zuckerberg decided that he wanted to destroy democracy, right? I think he just was trying to rate the physical appearance of his female classmates.
Right.
Right? And these things happen. And so you can't really solve problems when you don't really know what they are yet. I do think that there should be a good feedback loop, and I do very much believe in in regulation. And I actually personally think that the government should have a much heavier hammer that it can wield, because I do think that there are a lot of companies that are disruptive, but really what they're doing is kind of like they act in disregard for social consequences, and then they just become too big to fail and can start manipulating policy. And I think that that's definitely bad. But I think the problem is that technology is complicated, and what happens to technology is also complicated. And I guess what I think, and obviously I think that this is probably something that you're much more of an expert than I am, but I think that the answer is probably that there isn't really a clean answer, and that what it is just ends up being this dynamic system with people pushing in both directions, and hopefully society gets it right more often than it gets it wrong. And I mean, I think that that's I guess what you hope for, is that you have smart people who care about things that are fighting on all the different sides of the battle. Because I mean, ultimately I think that one thing that I think is actually probably worth mentioning is that you also can't make these decisions in a vacuum, right? Because we are one country, and there are other countries as well. I mean, obviously that's like kind of the argument that people at Palantir, I think, make, which is not super, which is not super settling either. But but the point is that it's, these things aren't really made on first principles, and I guess with a lot of these things, they feel like they are just inherently sticky social compromises. And
well, and we have a regulatory system, of course, which allows, right, it encourages private entities to move in these directions, and as you point out, finding that balance is a challenge. We're chatting with Kris Chaisanguanthum of bsky on KZSU-FM, Stanford, and Hearsay Culture. Let me ask you probably the most dystopian question, and then I'll ask one more dystopian question, Kris, and then we'll go in a different direction. So I'm a law professor. I mean, I do Hearsay Culture, and I'm expanding it, but I am paid to be a law professor. Why shouldn't I be very concerned that the hologram of Professor Dave Levine will teach just as well as the real live Dave Levine? So thank you, Professor Levine. Record your next class in holograms, and then good luck for the rest of your career, because we have what we need.
The funny thing about that is people worry about technology making their jobs obsolete. I think that actually, I think the people who should worry the most are actually the technologists, right? Because I'm not going to be on the cutting edge in about 15 minutes. It's interesting, when you think about the potential of things like AI and holography to replace jobs. I mean, I think that is a very, very serious problem that we need to sort of figure out. I think that if you assume that the point of a job is value creation, which, just to be clear, I don't think that that's always what it is, and I certainly don't think that. I think that education is only partly about the dissemination of knowledge. Then yeah, I mean, I think that what's really happening is not that I think that these technologies are replacing people in the sense of making it much cheaper to do something that's almost as good, right? And I think that it sort of, and I think that the question that we have to sort of ask ourselves is, what is the real value creation with a job, a job in particular? I think about, obviously manufacturing is one where robots can. I mean, I was thinking about travel agencies. It used to be I think if you ask a travel agent, they'll say yeah, it's the personal touch, and being able to to curate your and concierge your vacation. But I think the market has shown that that's not really something that at least most people want. And in fact, at this point, if you want to talk to somebody at an airline, you have to pay more.
Right. Right.
And so I think that it's a really, really interesting question. And I think that I generally subscribe to a lot of the views of Thomas Veblen, Thorsten Veblen. And I think that as we progress as a society, more and more of our sort of value creation is actually really more about filling people's emotional and social needs, rather than actual survival or logistical needs. So I think it will be really interesting to see how that shakes out. that being said, I also think that the people that are going to be making these decisions, the people who will define what the future of the economy looks like, are people who are younger than me. And and I think that as Franley Woods was saying, you can't really understand something that's not your generation.
Right.
So I actually think that a better person, even though I'm building technology, you would probably get a better answer from like just finding a random 12-year-old.
Right. And and look, I mean, and this is, of course, that you've keyed into it, to be fair, which is the alternative to what you're doing is to not do it at all. And we do have the laws of unintended consequences. The issue to me boils down to a question of what are acceptable risks. Let me ask you one more dystopian question.
Sure.
And it's one that ties into something you alluded to earlier. So we've got holographic technology, which is being used in entertainment, particularly to do concerts. And so I want to play a clip here of the hologram of the late music superstar, Whitney Houston. I want to be clear with listeners that is the audio from a YouTube video posted by a company called Base Hologram Productions that does a Whitney Houston holographic tour. And Whitney Houston, the individual, the human being, passed away a number of years ago. Kris, what's your take on that one?
Yeah, I think they also did this with like Tupac and like with Maria Callas, right?
Yes, right.
Yeah, I mean, so just to be briefly pedantic, because I think I would lose my credentials if I don't point this out. These sorts of things are actually not technically holograms. It's actually an optical effect to give a 2D image, a sense of physical presence. Mm-hmm. And if people are listening, want to Google Pepper's Ghost, it's actually been around for like a few centuries. That being said, I think that
so to be clear though, you would say that's not
technically a hologram, but I do think that the underlying question that you're asking is very valid. Mm-hmm. And I guess my feeling is that if you're recreating imagery and you're not pretending it's something than what it is, I don't really feel like, just viscerally. I mean, obviously I'm not like a probate law person but I feel like that's not more problematic than, for example, going to a light show with Pink Floyd, or watching a concert video of somebody, because essentially that's what that is. It's basically a concert video with a new backing band, not unlike when the other Beatles made those songs in the 90s with John Lennon's old recordings. But I think that to me, what actually makes me a little bit more uncomfortable is when these things are used to present as things that they are not. For example, I think there was a commercial, I think for Pepsi, that used footage from Easy Rider, and it was like manipulated. I mean, I think Forrest Gump did that as well, but that was presented as a work of fiction. And that feels a little bit more thorny to me. And I think that similarly, obviously deep fakes is something that's kind of problematic, and obviously a lot of and yeah, I mean, I think that's these are very very real issues. I think a lot of these technologies just make the line a lot. I think they expose how salient the issues are. But yeah, I mean, I don't think that the technology is really the central piece of the issue. I think that these are what is the value of being able to manipulate the mythos of a famous figure? What does it mean to be famous? What kind of privacy rights do people have when they die? Obviously these are things that I'm sure lots of people who actually study these specific things for a living.
Well,
yeah,
no, I was gonna say, I mean, to your earlier point, right? You could say, as the creator of technology, that's not your department either, right? In other words, the legality of using one's likeness, for example, presumably, I would assume, right, the folks that are doing these tours are doing it with the permission of the copyright holder to Whitney Houston. But when we think about copyright law, right, we think about music, we think about art, we don't really think about the person themselves. You mentioned, and I really neglected to ask it, and I do want to push on it, right? Misinformation and disinformation. So, is this technology a technology that in the wrong hands exacerbates the problem? And if so, I will ask you, even though you're not a lawyer and you don't play with TV, what do you think the law should do about this, if anything?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the problem is, there's a metaphor where I guess it's a parable where, like, if you put a frog in boiling water, it will jump out. But if you put a frog in a pot and you start heating it, it will just stay there because it won't realize that it's hot. And I guess in terms of policy, I'm definitely like an external observer. But I think one of the problems right now is that it seems like these sorts of things change the world very quickly. And I think what technology does is sort of accelerate certain kinds of fundamental changes. By the way, I think a lot of these changes are not actually. I think that they're emergent from the dynamics of the economy and socioeconomics, and not technology itself. But nonetheless, they make things happen a lot faster. And so you end up like that frog, where one day you wake up and you realize, like, what just happened, right? And I think that's kind of what happened with Facebook. And I mean, I think that obviously this is probably from a position of idealism. I think part of the problem is that people sort of think of regulation as a negative thing. And so, like, I think that you have this sort of adversarial relationship between technology and law. I think that that's probably being played up a little bit, especially by people like Josh Hawley, since I'm in Missouri,
Right.
Which I think is actually very negative, because I think that, like, a lot of these things, I think that should be it should be policymakers and technologists working together, collaboratively. And I guess one of the things that I find very common with people who build technology is that, like, a lot of people, who when you go to school and you are really good at things like computer science and science and math, people assume that you're very smart. And and I think that people then convince you that you are smarter than other people and that you're able to figure everything out. And I think that that's actually kind of a toxic attitude. And I would like to think that that I mean, I think that a lot of people in technology do have this hubris. And like, I think that there is a lot of value to trying to get companies to work with with people who actually have nuanced views of the other parts of the things that they don't think about. Like, I don't study, like, I never I don't have a PhD in, like, these sorts of sociological and economic and law type issues. And I think that I definitely I would like to think that I will always be interested in learning what these people have to say, and trying to leverage the fact that other people have spent their whole lives studying these things, rather than just thinking that I know everything just because I happen to be good at math.
Yeah. Well, and you said that earlier, and I will reveal not state the obvious, that I share, right, that view, and certainly a big focus of Hearsay Culture since its inception in May 2006 has been to educate way outside the classroom, virtually, physically, right, or intangibly, with a view towards making better policy decisions. Kris, we've got a few minutes left. And now that I've spent 20 minutes raising all of the dystopian issues, I do want to give you the opportunity to be clear about this. We've discussed the downsides, but how do you see the technology improving our lives? I mean, again, drone technology has been criticized by my friend Peter Osaro, right, as being a technology. He has an organization called Stop Killer Robots, because they can literally be armed and kill people, but they can also deliver food, right, and medicine and other things in places where the infrastructure doesn't exist to do that easily. So here's your opportunity, Kris, and I'll give you a couple of minutes on this. How do you see the technology improving our lives in the next 5 to 10 year horizon?
Are you asking about holographic technology specifically, or technology in general?
No, holographic technology specifically, as you have defined it.
Yeah. Yeah. No. I mean, I do think that there is a lot of value to communications. I think that there's a lot of things that are going to be, like, I think I think that, like being able to see better, and to like I think if you think about a television or your computer monitor, right, and you're looking at a flat picture of me, but I think that, what how cool would that be, like if I were just like, if it seemed like I was just sitting there talking to you, right? I mean, I think things like that, that's sort of the I think that that's the future we're building towards. Like, how cool would it be if, like, you wanted to buy a car and you could just, sit inside of it? How cool would it be, like, if you had to move across the country for a new position and you knew exactly, your house was there because you were confident that you bought the right one. So I think that those are things that I think are going to be exciting. I think that getting a very intimate performance of, your favorite musician or comedian or whatever performer that that you like, being able to watch sports events. I think that these are things that I think they're going to matter, and I think that these are things that once we get them, it's going to be really hard to go back. I also think that just a lot of very small things that improve our lives, like I think a lot of transactions will be a little bit more smooth and easier in ways that that will be small and not sexy, but they'll improve your life. I think that, for example, I think things like online dating could be very greatly improved. I think like I said, buying things, submitting insurance claims, collaborating with your coworkers on physical things. All these things can be improved, and I think that and that's the thing, like with cloning, like I think biology is a little bit stickier because it involves life. But this just sort of holographic technology to me seems to have so many benefits that it's just not like, I certainly think that all these conversations should be had about like what not to do, but there's so many positives that seem so obvious to me that not doing it just doesn't seem like the right answer. Just because essentially what is holography is it's sort of like teleportation of information.
So let me close. Let me close the interview, and we're chatting with Kris Chaisanguanthum, excuse me, of VSby and KZSU-FM, Stanford, and Hearsay Culture. Let me just ask you this, Kris. So now I'm going to give you an opportunity, not because I feel bad, but because I was going to ask it anyway, because I think it's been a great interview, and I appreciate your candor in taking these questions on. But you're currently advertising for a position on your website at bsky.io for a, quote, algorithms engineer. And I think, I always like to focus a bit on people that are looking to enter a field, that are looking to graduate from school and think about their careers. What is the skill set that you look for a, quote, algorithms engineer? And by the way, what is an algorithms engineer? And I'm going to have to ask you, in the interest of time, to spend a minute on this.
All right. Yeah, I think that it's basically somebody that does, it's basically an engineer that builds the algorithms, like basically the processing algorithms, and not the software itself as much. I think that actually everything is multidisciplinary at this point. I realize that that's kind of like a cop-out answer. The things that I generally look for, which I think are ironically, just underrated, is just the ability to think and communicate clearly, and the ability to accomplish things of scope. You would be surprised how many people go through life without actually like seeing large projects through. In terms of, in terms of specific skills, we use a lot of math, graph theory, image processing. There's a field called compressed sensing. And then, traditional computer science, things like mathematical optimizations, like computer vision. But just, the tenacity and ability to build and deploy things quickly and iterate quickly.
Kris Chaisanguanthum, the CEO of VSby.io, the former KZSU DJ, being interviewed by a current, not quite DJ, but host. Kris, thank you for joining us today on the show. I definitely invite you back. I appreciate you taking on these questions. I'm excited to see where the technology goes. Certainly my two sons, who are 11 and 14, are very excited about that as well. Thank you for joining us today on Hearsay Culture. So, folks, the show can be heard, as you know, Fridays, 8 p.m. Pacific time on KZSU. You can also listen to the show by going to any of your podcast apps. Please do email me with your comments, suggestions, and feedback at dave@hearsayculture.com or by going to hearsayculture.com. Very exciting plans in the work for the future of Hearsay Culture that will be rolling out in the coming weeks. But for now, I'll say thank you for listening. Please stay tuned to KZSU for more diverse programming, and have a great day.